Black Widow is finally out. It dropped yesterday in theaters and on Disney Plus, and of course, it stars Scarlett Johansson as the title character, one of my personal favorite MCU characters. She has been for a while, and her solo movie is long overdue. The fact that it took this long is insane. It took 11 years since she was first introduced in Iron Man 2. It's crazy to me, and this film was delayed, I think, like 3 times or something because of obviously the pandemic, but I'm glad we finally got it. And in Black Widow, we explore a little bit of her past with her family and all this, and we get to see what happened to her between the events of Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War. And yeah, I like this movie. I liked it quite a bit. It wasn't anything special. I don't think it's top tier MCU or anything, and explaining the plot of the movie is a little bit hard. You look up a description on the internet and they use all these like fancy words and stuff, which is kind of funny, but I did really enjoy the movie. I do have a bunch of problems with it, and I would like to do a spoiler video on it because a lot of my problems I kind of do have to go more into, but no spoilers in this video. Don't worry, I won't spoil anything or even hint at anything. But I feel like I have to start off with the obvious and the positive, which is Scarlett Johansson is fantastic as Natasha Romanoff or Black Widow, whatever you want to call her. She's amazing. As I said before, she's one of my favorite MCU characters, and here she shines once again. I mean, she's just such a gem of an actress. She's one of my favorites, and seeing her on screen as Black Widow once again after the events of Endgame is pretty interesting and very nice to see, I think, at least. But a lot of people are saying this, and I would agree, the standard of this movie is Florence Pugh as Yelena, or however you say her name. And the reason she is the standard is because she's funny, she has some amazing action sequences, she's probably like the most memorable thing about this movie, and that's kind of one of my problems we'll talk about later. But she has so many lines. Like one time she's with Natasha in the store, and she's like, yeah, why do you always do this pose, and like you flick up your hair, or you make it seem like everybody's looking at you all the time and all this, and she just has so many lines, and she swears a bunch in this movie. It's a lot, and I think it worked every time, especially for her character. And David Harbour plays the Red Guardian, who I was very excited to see here because I think it's a really interesting character, and there are definitely things with his character that people question with the future, which I will go into in a spoiler video. But he was also really fun here. He had some really badass action sequences as well, and Rachel Weisz was also really cool here. She had really great chemistry, and I feel like all of these people, they kind of bounced off each other well because they do play a family here. That's not a spoiler, don't worry. I think that's kind of obvious from the trailer. And I went into this movie, I'd seen the trailer I don't know how many months back. I know they kept releasing them, and I kind of just avoided them because I didn't want to see too many clips here, and I know a lot of people said they spoiled too much here, and just from like the little 2-second clips I've seen on Twitter or whatever, I would kind of agree with that with the trailer, but I totally understand. But I will say the biggest problem of the movie for me, well, at least one of them, was that it really just felt like it had no stakes, which obviously I know it's a prequel and all this, like it takes place between the events of 2 films, and we've already seen those films, so I totally get it. And to kind of counter that point in a way, I think that the stakes are very low for our lead character, but I was interested to see what was going to happen with the other ones. But I will say, sometimes we're watching it with the big action sequences when characters are like about to die, I'm like, yeah, they don't die. Like, we see them later. So kind of going into it, there's a little bit of that. And there isn't really like that big sequence that really sticks in your head. Like, there's a bunch of great action sequences here, and I think the stunts are amazing, everything. The action is great, but when looking back at the movie, I watched it last night, and I can't say there's one scene that really stuck with me. I don't think any of them are like the best MCU scene, or at least one of them. Like, I think they were all very good. They were impressive, of course, because it's the MCU. I mean, I love the MCU. I'm wearing a Falcon Winter Soldier shirt. I talk about the MCU shows weekly, and I don't know, there was just something about it that almost, it didn't feel forgettable. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I will say there were many times where like something big would happen, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's good, but really? The movie starts off in a way that I didn't expect, but I was really glad because I think the starting, like the first act is really interesting, and the third act is easily the best part of the movie, but that second act really does kind of slow down, and the movie is 2 hours and like 13-14 minutes. For me, it didn't feel that long, but in that middle act, there were times where characters are just sitting down talking, and I'm like, I should be interested in what's going on because I'm interested when they do it in the other MCU movies, but for some reason, it kind of just dragged a little bit there, and I wasn't as invested as I would like to be in those scenes. But I will say that first act is amazing, the third act is really great, and one big thing people are talking about, I'm not going to say too much about this because it does go into spoilers spoiler territory, but the villain of this movie is kind of like that whole 2014, 2015 kind of era, like the early era of the MCU, kind of phase 1, phase 2, where the villains are very lackluster and they don't really have a strong impact or anything. For this movie, yeah, it's kind of the same. I mean, the MCU has been on this great streak of villains for the most part. I mean, we've had Thanos is obviously the best one. We've had Zemo. We've had Vulture. Like, we've had some really great ones. Mysterio, I also really enjoy. I know that's kind of maybe controversial to say. It depends on who you ask. But for me, this one, the main villain of the movie is just so bland and everything. And what they do with the character of Taskmaster, the idea behind Taskmaster is really interesting. Again, I won't say it. It's not a spoiler, but I just want to watch what I'm saying here. Really interesting. Execution worked really well in some scenes, but overall not as a whole. Although there's one scene, especially on a bridge and against Red Guardian, that you've seen in the trailer that was really cool. And once again, I do have to emphasize, I know I said there wasn't like any big scenes that really stuck with me, but the action is very good across the board. I do think it's probably the best thing about the movie, besides like Scarlett Johansson and Florence Pugh and David Harbour. Like, the acting is very good, the dialogue for the most part is very good, and it was definitely intense, but because it is a prequel, and this is just the fault of almost any prequel out there, the stakes do feel low, especially for our main character. Although there were some really funny scenes, I do think this film is very funny. A lot of it does come down to Yelena. She has a bunch of hilarious lines, and the banter between Yelena and Natasha really worked well. I did enjoy this movie. I do have a bunch of problems with it, and I feel like it could improve if I watch the MCU in chronological order, and I see this after I watch Civil War, and then I watch this, then I watch Infinity War, something like that. I feel like it could kind of work better like that. As a standalone film, it is a good movie, it's just not nearly one of my favorite MCU films. Black Widow is a ton of fun. It has some great action sequences, great characters, great dialogue and chemistry, everything you need for that. Although I will say, because it is a prequel, the stakes do feel a little bit low, and at times it can kind of drag when it's trying to be something bigger than it is, which is just like a smaller standalone film. Yes, I went into it knowing it was going to be a smaller scale film than the other ones we've had, and I wouldn't say it disappointed me, it just did not shock me. Still, I recommend watching it if you are a fan of the character, because obviously Natasha is one of my favorite MCU characters, and I'm going to give Black Widow a 3.5 out of 5. Honestly, I'm just glad that we're finally seeing this movie. I've been dying to see it for a while. I know a lot of people aren't really like that hyped for it, and they never really were, but for me, I'm like, yeah, I mean, she's one of my characters. I think I've said it 3 or 4 times in the video, so I was really excited to see what they were going to do with her, and I will say what they did with her character was really good here. I, again, would say Yelena is the standard of the movie, but it kind of felt like the writers and everyone were kind of pushing her to be the standout, because she obviously is confirmed to Hawkeye, and I will say the end credit sequence, I won't say anything about it, but I will say very good, almost shocking in a way, but I'll talk about that in a spoiler video. I'm not sure if I'll do that on my own or with someone else, but make sure to stick around for that. And if you've seen Black Widow, please tell me what you thought of it in the comments down below. It's sadly the first MCU movie I haven't seen in theaters since the first one I saw, if that makes sense. Ant-Man was the first MCU movie I saw in theaters, and that all the way up to Far From Home. I saw them all in theaters, and then this one I did have to watch at home, which kind of, I don't know, it kind of took away from it a bit. But again, I do highly recommend this film, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Over and out.